Hi everyone, life often throws us curveballs. That night, the house was unusually quiet. My sister was in her room, and I was also huddled in my small space, trying to finish an unfinished book. The clock struck midnight, and the night seemed to get thicker. The only sound was the wind blowing through the window. Then, a knock on the door broke the quiet atmosphere. I was a little startled, but then I told myself that maybe my sister needed something, so I walked out the door and there was my brother-in-law, looking a bit wobbly. The hallway light was dim and I could smell alcohol on his breath. He smiled at me, but it was a strange smile. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "Wife, I miss you so much." I was frozen for a second before I could react. He rushed forward and hugged me, his arms clumsy. Then we were in it. My name's Lily. I grew up in a happy family in the countryside, where every morning began with birds singing in the fields. My parents were farmers, and they loved and protected me. But when I turned 18, I had to leave home to go to university. That trip was a big turning point in my life, and it led to some unexpected stories. I moved to the city, and stayed with my sister. She was married to John, and they were living in a lovely little apartment in the city center. When I first arrived, I was surprised by the fast pace of life in the city. It was very different from my hometown, with its crowded traffic and towering high-rise buildings. However, I soon realized that city life was not so strange. People are still working hard, but they work in comfortable offices, not exposed to the sun and rain like in the countryside. My sister and brother-in-law are very kind. On the first day I arrived, they happily welcomed me with bright smiles. In comfortable offices, not exposed to the sun and rain like in the countryside. My sister and brother-in-law are very kind. On the first day I arrived, they welcomed me with bright smiles. I felt so lucky that my sister had a thoughtful husband who always loved and cared for her in the early days of living here. I always thought that I would be stable and that good things would continue to come, but I did not know that everything had just begun when I first arrived. My sister and brother-in-law always kept a certain distance when showing affection in front of me. Perhaps they understood that I had just come from the countryside and was unfamiliar with city life. They wanted to make me comfortable. However, after a long time living together, they began to be more comfortable and the intimate gestures between the two became more and more natural. At first, it was just a light touch or a smile, but later the hugs and kisses between them were no longer hidden. Many times one day, I saw them being really affectionate and I felt really embarrassed. It was a weekend and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law were both at home because they didn't have to go to war. I had an appointment with some friends I'd met at university, and we went to the library to study and review before leaving. I said goodbye to them and saw them sitting together in the living room, watching TV and chatting. They were looking very peaceful, and the study session passed quickly in the afternoon. I went home, entered the living room and suddenly saw my sister and brother-in-law sitting on the sofa hugging each other tightly. My brother-in-law was stroking my sister's hair and she was leaning her head on his shoulder. Not only that, but I also saw them exchanging a very affectionate kiss. That moment made me feel both embarrassed and unsure of what to do. I stood there for a while, trying to stay calm. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear my footsteps. They both turned to look, and my sister smiled. It was a little mischievous, but she looked natural. My brother-in-law also smiled. I could tell he was studying in a group. I nodded awkwardly, trying not to look at them. I quickly replied, "Yes, it's fine." I could tell from my sister's confused look that she was trying to figure out what was going on. She started laughing. "Your face is red. What's wrong?" I was so confused that I didn't know what to say, so I tried to act natural. "I just think you two are too affectionate. It makes me so embarrassed." The brother-in-law burst out laughing while the sister covered her mouth and laughed. Both of them looked so happy. She teased back, "JN and I are just in love. There's nothing to be shy about." I could only smile. Riley, I felt like I had just fallen into a strange situation. "Okay, I'm going upstairs." I quickly walked up to my room and closed the door. I closed the door and took a deep breath. My mind was still reeling from what I had just witnessed. I knew that they were husband and wife and that such affection was normal, but I still felt embarrassed for some reason. Perhaps it was because I had never witnessed someone express their feelings so clearly in front of me in the countryside. My parents rarely showed affection for each other and were even very sparing with intimate words, so this scene was both new and awkward for me. I sat down on the I went to bed, trying to push away the awkwardness in my heart. After all, it was a good thing that my siblings loved each other so much. They had always treated me well and made me feel like I was part of their small family in the city. I told myself that I needed to get used to it and learn to accept the most natural things in life. However, sometimes it made me so embarrassed that I had to find a way to escape to my room, like just now. I kept telling myself that this was normal and that my brother and sister loving each other like that was a good thing. Every time I saw them being affectionate, I couldn't help but feel something in my heart. It was a strange feeling, hard to name. Perhaps it was the sadness of a young girl who had just entered an independent life, leaving her family for the first time. Looking at the way John took care of her, from the small gestures to the gentle eyes, I couldn't help but feel. But I secretly hoped that one day I would also have someone who loved me like that. Those thoughts stayed with me for many days while I was studying, walking on the street, or even lying in my room alone. I asked myself, will I ever meet someone like that, someone who can make me feel safe and truly loved? Sometimes I imagine myself holding someone's hand and sharing the little things in life together. I suddenly laughed to myself, but that's just my imagination. I thought that life with my brother and sister would always be like that, a small family, not mine, but enough to make me feel warm. But it turns out life always has surprises, things you never see coming. That day started like any other. I woke up early, had breakfast with my sister, and then went to school. My sister and brother-in-law also left home for work as usual, each with their own busy schedule. It was a normal day, nothing special. At school, I focused on my lectures and friends, but in my heart my sister would always pass peacefully like that. It was a small family, not mine, but enough to make me feel warm. But life always has surprises, and no one can predict what will happen. That day started like any other. I woke up early, had breakfast with my sister, and then went to school. My sister and brother-in-law also left home for work as usual, each with their own busy schedule. At school, it seemed like a normal day. I focused on my lectures and friends, but in my heart, I always waited until the evening to come home to eat dinner with my family because that was when I felt closest to them. When I got home, my sister was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner. I washed my face and rolled up my sleeves to help her. We cooked and chatted, sometimes laughing. My sister has always been like that, gentle, thoughtful, and loving. She always gives the greatest love to her family. The meal was ready on the table. That was left to John. My sister sat down, looked at her watch and said, "John is late. He must be busy at work again. He has a lot of work to do right now." Just then the phone rang. She quickly picked up the phone. It was John calling through. I heard him announce that he had to come home late today. The reason being an important meeting to sign a contract with his boss. She gently replied, "You just go to work. It's okay. Lily and I will eat. First, if you come home late, remember to eat something." She hung up, sighed, then looked at me and smiled. "Okay, let's eat first." We started our meal. My sister seemed a little quieter than usual, perhaps because she was not used to having dinner without John, But she still tried to keep the atmosphere comfortable, occasionally picking up food for me and asking about school. I also smiled back, trying to keep the meal from being too boring. After the meal, we cleaned up the dishes together. By this time, my sister, after a long day, she sat down on the sofa, turned on the TV, and leaned back. I brought her some warm water and sat down to watch it with her, but after a while, she yawned softly and turned to me. She said, "I'm going to bed first. Sitting for too long can make you fall asleep." I nodded, watched her enter the room and close the door. The house suddenly became quieter. I sat alone on the sofa for a few more minutes. The light from the TV screen was flickering, but I was no longer focused on the program. Looking at the clock, I decided to go to my room to do my homework. When I got to my room, I closed the door, pulled out a chair, and sat down at the desk. The notebooks and textbooks had been laid out since morning, waiting for me to continue my work. Looking at them, I sighed and tried to concentrate on finishing my homework before the end of the day. But for some reason, a strange feeling crept into my mind. I was writing, but I stopped and listened to the small noises from outside the hallway. They seemed normal, but I was curious about why the house was so quiet. It was strange, because usually, my sister is in her room and I'm in mine, trying to concentrate on an unfinished book. But tonight, we were both in our rooms, trying to ignore the silence. The clock struck midnight, and the night seemed even thicker. I was still trying to ignore the silence when I suddenly heard. I was reading when I heard a knock on the door. It was my brother-in-law, who I hadn't seen for a while. He was drunk and smelled of alcohol. The light from the hallway was dim, but I could see his eyes were hazy. He looked at me for a long time. He didn't say anything at first, but then he suddenly spoke. His voice was slurred. "I miss you so much," he said. I was stunned. I didn't understand what was going on. "John, it's me." "I'm Lily," I said, sounding confused. My voice was full of worry. But he didn't seem to hear me before I could react. He rushed forward, his clumsy arms hugging me tightly. "Don't avoid me. I love you," he said. His voice was lost, almost whispering into my ear. My whole body stiffened. Fear and confusion surrounded me. I tried to struggle out. I tried to get away from him, but I couldn't. My brother-in-law was drunk and confused. He didn't realize that the person in front of him wasn't my sister. His words and actions left me feeling helpless and at a loss. I tried to wake him up, but he didn't hear me. I shook him and pushed him away, but he didn't notice. His eyes were hazy, and he seemed to be under the influence of alcohol. He looked at me, but he didn't see me. But not at me, but at another figure. "I miss you so much." His voice was hoarse, choked like a sigh in the midst of a deep pain. He continued, "I want you. I want you. I want you so much that I can't bear it anymore." Hearing those words, I understood that they were not for me, but for her, the one who was always in his heart. Even though I knew he was drunk, I still couldn't stop my heart from beating wildly, partly because of panic and partly because of his. His words seemed to stab straight into my heart. I knew what was going on, but I couldn't escape. I was swept away. My body betrayed my reason. I was helpless before his intensity. I was afraid. I was afraid of myself. I was afraid of the emotions that were surging beyond control. Then I let it all go. I let him continue to call out someone else's name while I quietly sank into my own confusion. He was still holding me tightly. His body was warm. His breath smelled strong. Strong of alcohol on my neck. I was frozen, unable to move or think. I was scared and confused, but before I could process any of it, we both fell onto my small bed. The cramped space seemed to shrink, leaving only him and me. In that moment, I knew that all boundaries between us had been completely destroyed. The sound of the wind blowing outside the window and the sound of cars ringing back and forth in the middle of the night all seemed to fade away, giving way to my rapid breathing, and my heart was racing. All my emotions were being washed away, and my reason was left behind. The man I thought would forever belong to my sister was now here with me, touching the deepest corners of my soul in ways I had never thought of. Time seemed to slow down, stretching out every second and minute. I didn't know if it was reality or just a hazy dream. His every action, every touch, and every drunken whisper all seemed to overwhelm me with emotions I couldn't control. I don't remember how I fell asleep. It was a dreamy sleep, with his warmth and presence enveloping me as the morning light filtered through the curtains. I heard my sister calling his name outside the door. The sound was like a bell ringing, pulling me back to reality. I opened my eyes, feeling confused, and immediately looked around the small room. I saw that the bed sheets were disheveled, clothes were scattered on the floor, and John was still lying there, breathing evenly. His face, he looked tired but peaceful. I felt an unnamed fear rising in my heart. Everything that happened last night came rushing back, like a slow-motion film. I didn't know how to face this. I didn't know how to face my sister. I didn't know how to face myself. I felt cold and confused. I quickly adjusted my clothes, my hands shaking, trying to hide the traces of a night that shouldn't have happened. My sister's voice called again, closer and closer, making me jump. My heart pounded. I quickly sat up. I was trying to stay calm, but my mind was still in chaos. I turned to John and gently shook him. "John, wake up." He opened his eyes, looking dazed and confused. "What's going on? Why are you here?" He looked around the room, confused as if trying to piece together scattered memories. I quickly adjusted my clothes, smoothed my hair, and took a deep breath. Everything seemed okay, so I pretended to yawn and walked out the door with a tired expression. When the door opened, my sister was standing there. She looked slightly annoyed. "Why aren't you up yet?" "It's almost time for school." I swallowed, trying to stay calm, and forced a smile. "I'm sorry. I studied too late last night, so I woke up late this morning." She glanced at me for a moment, then turned and went into the kitchen. She gave me a look, but then stopped. She said, "Hurry up, get ready, and come out to eat or you'll be late." I said, "Yes," trying not to show my embarrassment as she turned and went into the kitchen. I stood there for a few more seconds to compose myself, then gently closed the door and returned to the room. I leaned down and called softly, "You're leaving." "She's in the kitchen." John slowly crawled out, his face still full of confusion. He stood up, looked at me, then unconsciously lowered his head. I said, "I'm sorry. Sorry, I don't know what happened last night. I just remember drinking a little too much, and then I didn't let him finish his sentence, interrupting it. It's okay, we shouldn't talk about this too much. The important thing is that you leave now before she suspects anything." He nodded, remorse evident in his eyes. I pointed to the window and climbed down, pretending to come in from outside when you weren't looking. He looked at me, hesitated a bit, but then did. He was told to be careful and slow when climbing down, so as not to make any noise. I breathed a sigh of relief. I quickly changed and prepared my school supplies, trying to make everything as normal as possible. Just then, I heard John outside, pretending to walk in and calling out loudly, "Good morning. It's so early today." My sister came out of the kitchen and looked at him for a moment, but didn't show any suspicion. "Are you sleeping at a friend's house?" I asked. "I didn't see you come home last night." He smiled awkwardly and scratched his head. "I had some work to do yesterday, so I came home late. Now I'm so hungry." My sister laughed and pulled him to the breakfast table. I quickly walked out, trying to look as natural as possible. Everything went smoothly. No one suspected anything, but I was still worried in my heart when breakfast was over and my sister went back to the room to prepare. I took the opportunity to whisper to John, I have to be careful. No one can know about this." He looked at me, nodded, and his eyes were full of guilt. "I understand. I'm really sorry. I'll do anything I can to make it up to you." I just shook my head, saying nothing more, when he left. I stood there watching his figure disappear with a heavy heart. I knew that things had gone beyond our control. From that moment on, I also knew that no matter how hard we tried, our relationship would never be the same again. We both knew what had happened was wrong, but neither of us had the courage to tell her the truth. Every time I looked at her, her bright smile and loving eyes for me and him made my heart feel heavy. I wondered how I could face her when I was keeping such a big secret. The feeling of guilt clung to me like a dark shadow, not giving me a moment of peace. After that night, John also became quieter when he was near me. It seemed like we were both trying to keep. I often think about that night and all the details. I don't know why I can't get it out of my mind. It just makes me more tormented. Many nights lying alone, I blame myself, blame John, and then blame fate for bringing things to this point. But no matter how many times I think about it, I still can't find an answer. How can I continue to live with this obsession without hurting my sister in the following days? I tried to minimize. I avoided looking into John's eyes and having unnecessary conversations. I felt like he was doing the same. He wasn't joking with me like he used to. When we were all together, the atmosphere between me and him was always heavy. My sister sometimes wondered what was going on, but she never suspected anything. This made me even more heartbroken. I knew I couldn't live like this. I couldn't let these conflicting emotions and obsessions consume me every day. After many nights I told my sister that I needed a quiet space to focus on studying and working. She didn't agree, saying that I didn't need to leave because staying at home was comfortable and there was someone to take care of me. I was determined to convince her, making up all kinds of reasons to show her that I'm an adult now and I want to learn to be independent. She looked at me, her eyes showed a hint of worry, but she finally agreed. "If that's what you think, I respect that. But if there's anything difficult, you have to tell me." I smiled and nodded, but my heart was filled with sorrow. How could I tell her that the real reason I left was to escape the sins I had committed on the day I left? John stood silently in the corner of the room, not saying a word. When I dragged my suitcase past him, he just looked at me, his eyes. I was filled with indescribable emotions. I didn't dare look at him for long. I just bowed my head and walked out the door. When the door closed behind me, I felt like I had just left a part of my life there. But at the same time, I also hoped that leaving would be a way for me to end all the torment and find the peace I had lost after moving out. I tried to start a new life away from the house that contained so many complicated emotions and memories. I had a lot of complicated emotions and memories that were really troubling me. Living in a small room wasn't easy, but at least I felt like I had some space to think more clearly. However, memories of that night still came back from time to time, especially in quiet moments. I wondered if I had done the right thing by choosing to stay silent and leave, or if I should have faced the truth from the beginning. But then I realized that there are secrets that, when exposed, can hurt not just one person, but many people, and I did not want to be the one to cause those wounds. JN and I kept in touch, but only a little, so that we could protect what was left. My sister still called regularly to ask about her and John's lives, their plans for the future, and the simple joys they shared. Every time I hear her voice, my heart feels both relieved and heavy. I know she still loves and trusts me as before, and I can only try to learn to live well so as not to let her down. Over time, I came to accept that some mistakes are unfixable, but we can change ourselves to avoid repeating them. I learned to forgive myself, not to forget, but to move forward. I focused on studying, work, and building an independent life. Gradually, the pain and guilt faded, but the lesson from my story remained. I realized that moments of weakness and decisions made while not sober can, if we make mistakes, we have to live with the consequences for the rest of our lives. My mistake not only affected me, but also put my family relationship in a fragile situation. It taught me a lot about emotional control, respecting boundaries in relationships, and taking responsibility for myself and others. My advice to everyone in any relationship is to stay sober and cherish what you have. Don't let temporary emotions or weakness cloud your mind and lose valuable things. When you make a mistake, don't run from it. Face it head on and do whatever you can to fix it. Learn from it, forgive yourself, and move on. But don't forget the lessons that mistakes have taught you. Life isn't always easy, but every challenge is an opportunity for us to grow, learn how to live better, and build a better future. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope these lessons are meaningful to everyone.